Hi, I'm Gabriela Houston. Welcome to my channel where we discuss storytelling in all its forms. It's my belief that storytelling is an intrinsic part of everyone's life, as well as an important part of many professions. On the show, I talk to writers, artists, journalists, researchers, and more about how they use storytelling in their jobs in life. So every other week, there's something different. So click like and subscribe for more. It really helps the channel. So today we're going to have a slightly different format of the show. We're going to have a three-way conversation on folklore and using mythology and folklore in our writing. And I have two amazing guests today, Shauna Lawless and Ronnie R. Virdi. So R. Virdi is an American wave for the loving audience, is an American urban fantasy author. If you haven't come across his books yet, two of his novels have been nominated for a Dragon Award, Grave Measures in 2016 and Dangerous Ways in 2017. And his novelette Messenger was nominated for a Nebula Award. And on my other side, it's Shauna Lawless. She's an author and lover of magical historical fantasy fiction. Shauna is Irish, and her writing's inspired by her childhood passion for Irish history and mythology. And she has spent the last 6 years learning the craft of writing and obsessing about Irish myths, famous druids, and warriors in Irish traditions. The Children of Gods and Fighting Men, her first novel in the Gael Song Trilogy, was published by Head of Zeus in 2022, and the second installment, The Words of Kings and Prophets, was released in autumn 2023. The trilogy will be completed with The Land of the Living and the Dead this year. So thank you both. This was like your list of accomplishments really long. So this was, I think, the longest intro I've done so far. So thank you for coming on the show and agreeing to do it. Like I'm really excited for our conversation.
Likewise.
Yeah, me too.
So first of all, I'd like you to sort of introduce your writing a little bit. So let's start with Ronnie. Your novels have, so your background, you're American with South Asian background, and your novels draw inspiration from multiple cultures. So unlike Shauna, who writes mostly inspired by Irish mythology, and myself, my books are inspired by Slavic mythology, yours are not necessarily rooted in a single tradition. So how do you approach this to create a cohesive whole?
With my most recent works, Tales of Tremaine, I am focusing mostly on Proto-Indo-European mythology and then everything that descended out of that. And I thought that would be one of the easiest ways because there's so many analogous myths that we have across different cultures that people from different cultures will see something similar or familiar through the history of how fantasy has first taken from myth. So even if they don't know much mythology, they'll see similar tropes and beats that they might not know came from those myths, but they might be more available in their culture through a lens they're more familiar with. And I thought targeting that sameness might help people feel more comfortable approaching a world that's fixed through more a South Asian lens, because my main character in that world is South Asian, and it starts in the past story in a South Asian analog. But I said it
so culturally, you definitely rooted to something that is non-Western necessarily, and then kind of introduce familiar elements.
Yes, so it takes place over two timelines. One of them actually is an analog of Portuguese, classic Spain, and Italian culture pre-Christianity and Catholicism, more close to, I don't like using the term pagan because it's usually like to denote and barbarize older cultures, but the idea of Basque paganism, which was predominant in the area over there. So before you had a monotheistic religion, because many cultures were polytheistic before, singular deity culture took over like Christianity. And I'm drawing mostly from those inspirations across how I do certain mythic tales inside, more mythic story beats that are closer to classic epics and stories. And I felt that even if my character's South Asian, using those beats and having it be a journey along a fictional Silk Road, people will understand like, okay, we're seeing it through his lens, but all these things are still familiar, even if they're different. So it kind of is like a warm, soft welcome into that world. And I think it removes some of the barriers people might have to foreignness.
Yes, I think it's really interesting, this kind of like balancing the familiarity and the kind of, also not rooting everything to the folklore that's already very well known, because there's like a lot of people who write about, you know, non-Western cultures sort of comment about the exposition tax, as it were, and the fact that English speaking readers often expect a great deal of explanation, isn't it? Like, I know, like my books have glossaries at the end, and I wasn't even sure if they were like necessary, but then like when I see the reader's response to them, I thought like, oh, okay, I'm really glad I did that, because they really struggled with certain
Right.
certain things that I even thought was normal. I remember I had like an editor once think that I made a mistake by changing the endings of the names depending on whether it's a woman or a man. I'm just like, but that's just all Slavic cultures. Or she was like, why does this character have so many aunties?
Right. Right.
So and so you kind of have to explain it quite a bit, isn't it?
Yes.
Do you find it easier because like you're sort of, you know, you grew up in America, right? So do you have more of an instinct about what is not obvious?
I think so, but I think that's something that every author has to learn, because if you, and I'd liken it to, like, let's say you're a hard sci-fi writer, you might have an engineering or tech background, knowing how to maybe make the high tech aspects of hard sci-fi more, I guess, easily acceptable to somebody who doesn't have that background. It's sort of the same skill set. I think we all have to learn that to some degree as an author. Growing up American definitely helped in some ways, but it's actually what made me want to research all this mythology, because I was so inundated growing up with Western mythology, and I got sparse bits through my Asian background and culture. And I realized there were some similarities then, but I didn't have the tools, the familiarity, understanding, and access to really start digging and realizing how similar so many myths were because of the Proto-Indo-European culture and how far they spread all the way to you know, Ireland and the Celts, all the way down to Greek and Lithuania, and then as far as the Avestani, Persian Iran, and South Asia. That's like a huge chunk of the world, all derived from this proto culture. But I had no idea that's why so many myths and beats were similar, because they came from this. Yeah, because what kid does. So it definitely helped, I think, understanding how Western narratives go, but it left me blind to realizing why there was so much familiarity and what was taken from the eastern part of the world. And I don't mean just Asia. I mean like Portugal, Spain, Irish myths that just eventually get co-opted and
I mean,
retold.
I think like we're gonna have to return to this, because the idea of like comparative mythology is actually like a surprisingly controversial one, because I interviewed Francis Young, who's a historian of belief, and I did not realize that he was like, yeah, his like comparative mythology is very, very controversial and things. So like, you know, it's interesting because sometimes you're so drawn to like similarities, but I think it's important to think about the difference as well, and we can come back to that. For Shauna, I wanted to say, because it's really interesting, like in many ways you guys come from opposite sort of roots into writing about mythology, because you were writing about something that you're really rooted in growing up, and you also write inspired by mythology that we think is, on the face of it, quite familiar, isn't it, to the Western readers? So I wanted what I wanted to ask you is, like, as an actual Irish person, what do you think are like the biggest misconceptions, if any, about like Irish folklore?
So I think the biggest thing is that Irish mythology and Irish folklore are slightly different. And I think most people know Irish folklore, which is, you know, like banshees and you know, like leprechauns and changelings and like the fairy people playing tricks on you. And obviously, like, it's like very Darby O'Gill and the Little People. Like a lot of people have watched that. It's like a Disney movie. Um, and obviously, we have St. Patrick's Day, and you see lots of leprechauns and green and, you know, all those colors then. But that is Irish folklore. And so to describe the difference, Irish mythology um, came before like Christianity. So I'm like touching on what Ronnie said there as well. So the mythology is basically what Ireland and Irish people would have believed in before the conversion happened. And so there's lots of magical beings, there's lots of magic, there's lots of great warriors, there's lots of battles, and it's all very exciting. And at the end of the mythologies that we know, the Tuatha Dé Danann, who are the magical people of Ireland, are banished underground. And that's then they become the fairy people. But in the mythologies, they're not bad. They don't play tricks on people. Actually, they free the people of Ireland from slavery. But then I think what you have is then once Christianity came in, as with everywhere really in Europe, they're trying to belittle, I suppose, the indigenous religions. And so you have these like magical people who become then small, like they're diminishing them in size, and they become these like pernicious tricksters who you'd be afraid of, like you wouldn't want to be around them. And that's kind of there then when the folklore comes in. And of course, when the Irish famine happens in about 1850, we had about 1.5 million people left Ireland, who went to England, and lots went to America. And I think that is why at the time when Irish folklore was at that was kind of what was in Irish people's minds, that's when it went over to America. And I think that is why people know that so well, like that kind of folklore has endured, because there was like a separation of a huge movement of Irish people who brought those stories with them, and the older stories at that time had been more forgotten. And it wasn't really until like the Irish like wars of independence in 1916 to 1921 that a lot of the people at that time had started to rediscover the older myths, and that caused a rise of popularity in those myths that didn't quite move over to America, I think. So I think, so that's a very long-winded answer, but that's just why I think lots of people, when they think of Irish mythology, actually think of folklore. And the mythology is huge. There's loads and loads of stories, and it's much, much older. And it would center around tribes of people called the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fomorians, and famous warriors like Cuchulainn and Finn McCool. And they're not leprechauns, and they're not like evil people that play tricks on you.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I'd never heard that, but it doesn't surprise me. Like, it's the same with ancient Slavic folklore, in the way that unlike with sort of Celtic mythologies or Norse mythologies, Slavic mythologies were not written down contemporaneously, because the political situation was different. The goal was to sort of convert those lands as quickly and brutally as possible. And so the aim was to erase the stories. And so, but the process was similar in a sense of like turning gods into demons, and helpful spirits into little devils, and and diminishing them, like you say. I did not realize that this was done in quite the same extent in Ireland, though, because obviously like a lot of the stories were written down, but I suppose.
Yes, they were written down, and that is actually funny because it was monks who wrote them down. So that's why we have them. So and it's funny, like because in some of the stories, like we have multiple versions of the same stories written in different monasteries. So I suppose if several monks are writing the same story, it's obviously a story that lots of people would have known, but every so often a monk would try to insert like Christianity into an Irish myth. So the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fomorians, they're kind of documented quite a few times, and like the wars between those two tribes. But there's one document that we have, and it's called the Book of Invasions. And the monk who wrote that decided that the first invasion in Ireland was actually Noah and his ark, and that they landed in Ireland. And so you have lots of these instances throughout the like the records where I guess the monks are really trying to like insert their own religion somehow into the stories.
Yeah,
which is funny.
Sometimes it's done better and sometimes it's done worse, isn't it? And like the funny thing is when it's so visible. Like there's a story I can think of basically one of the values of ancient Slavs was just welcoming strangers, and reciprocity, and just being sort of empathetic towards smaller creatures. And there's a story about like the hero basically makes an agreement with a little helpful spirit, and the spirit helps him. He feeds the spirit. It's just mutually beneficial. And at the end of the story, there's this bit tacked on, then like, but once he died, they all went to hell because you should not make any kind of agreements with the demons and devils. And it's just so obviously not in keeping with the story.
Yeah.
But
Yes. It's just been added on at the end.
Yes,
It's like this weird, yeah.
It's just not done very subtly. I was wondering, like, Ronnie, do you find like in your research, because when you look at like the Hindu epics and the kind of sort of South Asian kind of views on religion and all that, like it's a living religion, and so it is still evolving, and it's and it's changing a lot. I've, like, a lot of people say that Hinduism of like early 20th century bears very little resemblance to the Hinduism of modern day. So what are you using as your like hooks, the things that kind of root you to what you see as the center of like your inspiration and those?
For me, I'm actually going back older than Hinduism. I'm going back to what it was before, which was Vedism during the Vedic period, which is where a lot of the epics were first written. And it's about the period where Indians started recording a lot more of their history, because before that, Sanskrit, which is the oldest surviving language that we have left, was mostly orally told and preserved. So we don't know how old the epics actually are, because we lost the point where people weren't keeping written records. They were orally telling them and passing them down. So we don't know how far it goes. But the Vedic period for me is where I can find the closest and the best links to the Proto-Indo-European influences. And then those are the myths and those versions that have the closest similarities to a lot of others. The way certain gods are written, roles changed over time with certain myths, which is not just unique to Indian culture. It's happened to a lot as different religions came in, different movements, revival periods or revisionist periods happened in cultures. So for me, going to that period seems just like the best, because I can see how things evolved from there, but I can also find enough chain links to how things from other cultures might have inspired or influenced it. It was the period with the widest diverse of works, including folk tales and fables, which, as Shauna mentioned, are separate than mythology, and I like including those as well because they're still part of culture. They were things that people were educated on or taught. People believed in. You would have your cultural localized folk tales, which are separate, and they can even be regional than your overall cultural myths, which are larger and usually tied to religion, as well as the fact that there's arguments, and this gets heated, so I want to say this very carefully, but that like Hinduism, which is a religion this day, wasn't always meant to be one, because the older Vedic belief of something called dharma, which was the idea of how do you live rightly, like the idea of universal cosmic goodwill, morality, being a good person. And Hinduism was supposed to be, argued by some, a guide towards that. So not necessarily religion, more like a tenet of beliefs that you operate on for spirituality, your physical development, the idea of, mind, body, and soul, of how do you just become a better and more upright person. And over time, it seems like some people have felt like it's become a religion and it was never supposed to be. And some will have the argument that it was always supposed to be a religion. That gets into controversial arguments between whoever wants to have that argument.
I think it really depends on the definition and how you want to define the religion, because the moment you have a philosophy that is so widely spread and is so codified and is also rooted in a non-material world in some ways, then arguably that becomes a religion. So but in the same way that some people, think of Buddhism more as a philosophy than religion, even though it is accepted as one of the great religions of the world, but people look at it in more sort of philosophical terms, isn't it?
Yeah, there's been the argument that you can be both a Christian and a Buddhist because it's supposed to be a way of life, has been something that Buddhists will also say. And that ties back into this and how a lot of mythology is actually spread. One reason there's a lot of similar takes of evolved stories from South Asia is actually because of the advent and the spread of Buddhism, where there are similarities between the Monkey King and Hanuman, and that story showed up after Buddhism arrived in China. And for example, Lord Indra from India is still actually worshipped and at least known in Japan. He shows up in Japanese stories. And the answer is, well, why does that happen? It's because of Buddhism. That started happening after Buddhism arrived in early Japan. and religion often, when it travels, becomes the carrier for stories. Obviously, people bring that with that, and or like Shauna brought up earlier, sometimes it's used to amend older stories and make them more palatable to help convert people, which unfortunately does strip the older culture of some of those truths. A lot gets lost in translation, unfortunately, including the origin of certain myths.
Yes, like evolution, sometimes, you lose useful bits as well, isn't it? But it's interesting, like, so taking on what, like, building on what you said about, like, the philosophy and philosophical underpinnings of mythologies and folklore as well, I would say, because I want to keep it to mythology and folklore. And I think those philosophical underpinnings are very important, because folklores and mythologies, I feel, are really a vehicle for kind of community building, and especially folklore is kind of closer to the everyday, and so it's like builds on community's values, it builds on communities' rules and explains the importance of those rules, and those can really vary so wildly between different cultures, even though there's a lot of religions that might have evolved from a single spot. Like, changing needs also change those values. So what would you think are, like, the core values of mythologies that you're interested in? Maybe Shauna, like, what would you say are the core values of the kind of ancient Celtic beliefs?
Ooh, that's interesting. Well, I think, if you read older stories, I do think you they tell you what people value in society. You
Hmm.
were saying about in Slavic mythology, like the looking after people and welcoming people is like a big thing. It's very similar to the Irish mythological
Reciprocity.
stories.
Let's not make them too
Yes,
generous. It's about
yes.
reciprocity. Yes.
Oh well, then maybe Irish is a slightly different. And in the earlier Irish like stories, kings would lose their kingship if they didn't keep a good haul. So if you were not feeding your guests well, and often this was like a huge slight. You didn't have to lose any battles; you just had to be stingy, and you would be ousted.
Did you have the
Um,
laws of protection around like welcoming guests? Just out of curiosity.
I don't know. I mean, I think because I know that's obviously something that's featured in, say, like Game of Thrones, where if you've offered someone food, um, you know that was you had officially welcomed them in. I don't know if I would say it's as explicit as that in
Mm,
Irish mythology, but purely because, like, I think as soon as anybody came to you, you were obliged to feed them and water them.
yeah,
That was a slight in itself that you wouldn't do that. You had to.
so yeah.
Um, so that's one thing. I think I don't know. There's a one story which I really like, and it's when Cuchulainn is on his deathbed. So one of the Tuatha Danann has fallen out with him and cast a spell on him, and he's on his deathbed, and he on his deathbed talks about what it is to be a king, and how you should govern. And actually, on reading it, it's very fair. You know, it actually feels quite modern. And this is a
Hmm.
text that we are finding in like the
So what
12th
are some of
century.
the examples, if you remember them? Not to
Oh,
put you on the spot, but
if you,
I'm just curious.
I will. I've got the book over there. I don't want to misquote Cuchulainn, but like it's fascinating. I can get the text if you want me to, and I'll read some of the points from it. But then that is also replicated in the Irish laws at the time. Like we have extracts of the Brehon laws, um, and it's all about fairness, and it's like a
Mm.
fine-based culture. So there's no prisons, like, as far as we are aware. It's all to do with if you cause someone any disadvantage, you will have to compensate them somehow. And
Hmm.
so I quite like that. I quite like that the mythology seems quite fair, because I know in other mythologies, like especially like Greek and Norse, sometimes power is lauded. The
Yeah,
strong survive
and
and
the
the weak
cunning.
fail.
Yeah,
Yes. And it's not really that way in Irish
yeah,
mythology. It seems to be, it's like fairness and freedom and generosity are things that are
yeah.
really highly valued.
So it's interesting because it's like, and the kind sometimes it trickles through to the kind of modern day. And I was thinking like when you were saying about like being generous, but not necessarily the kind of laws of hospitality being about protection. Like for Slavs, the when you offer your guest bread and salt, that's like, breaking bread with them. That is, you're under my protection.
Right.
And you basically, the worst crime you can commit is to hurt a guest at your table. Like the punishment for that is like instant, the whole world sort of, comes down upon you. But like in Norse mythology, you don't have that because they regularly slaughter each other at the dinner table. So like with no visible punishment, like it's just kind of whoever's the strongest and the most cunning.
Yeah, no, that's funny actually. And see, whenever I think of it in Irish history, see, once Christianity had come to Ireland, and the Irish, they didn't really convert very well to start off with. So they are still really adhering to their like pagan customs and norms. But they are now kind of bound by some of these Christian elements that they've had to undertake. So um, kind of pre-5th century, I suppose, if you wanted to be king, lots of people could be king. You only had to be descended from a king within 5 generations. So potentially you could have like 20, 30 men wanting to be king, and you could have like combat, I guess, if you wanted to solve who should be king. But by the time Christianity came, and obviously murder is a sin, they kind of realized that they couldn't do that. They couldn't kill anyone anymore.
Only under certain conditions, as we know from history.
Well, no. In Ireland, they then started to blind people, because in the mythology, you couldn't be a king if you were blind or had lost a limb. And so then you have this absolute, they call it's like a plague of blind princes in the 11th and 12th centuries, where the kings realize that you can't kill someone, but you can blind them and stop them being king. And then you haven't committed the sin of murder. And so you have
I
these,
love
like,
how that's the like, we are so Christian, like,
I know.
this new religion of mercy, let us adhere to that and just blind our like, what do you think, like, Roddy, but like, because you were mentioning like, I can see you like pondering, because like you have mentioned like obviously all the kind of rules and like how to live well and all of that. Like, do you see how in the sort of old Vedic beliefs were those rules explained? Like how what kind of stories show us like how you're supposed to be? Oh,
Okay, I realized I was muted. Yeah, to make sure there's no background noise. So there's actually a couple forms of Indian storytelling that actually are sort of prescriptive on how to live. Actually, you would recite certain folk tales and fables that have motifs and themes, and that's not unique to just South Asian culture. But in terms of certain like examples, generosity is one, like Shauna was talking, that's really big. It even shows up in the epic, certain epics where Garan actually in a fit of generosity gives up his golden armor. So he has armor very similar to Achilles that is supposed to protect him from harm. In his particular case, it's given to him by his father, who is the sun god. And as long as he wears his golden armor, he can't die in battle. Like he can't be mortally wounded. And it was so important for him to give it up in generosity, but it unfortunately leads to his death. But in terms of morals and beliefs, a lot of the ancient Vedic epics have similarities to both Irish, some Norse, although again, the Norse gets very dark and grimdark, and the South Asian ones don't. And even the Greeks about certain philosophies for your personal betterment and development, certain moral things you should do about kindness. Respect is obviously a huge one, especially certain tiers of respect, either to father figures and mother figures. And then there's another layer of respect and relationship between one's mentor or teacher. And obviously that's very different for noble characters, because at that time in the world, in a lot of the old epics, the hero usually has a specific mentor or a few mentors that are teaching them because of their birth and privilege. And you have a very special young to adulthood relationship with this mentor. So that's obviously another kind of thing. I don't know if there was ever a guest right hospitality one like Game of Thrones or what Shauna brought up, but there is some, I think that's a societal thing, less than maybe inspired by epics, unless it happens to be in an
Mm.
epic giving guess, right? I can't think of any off the top of my head. But most of the ones in the South Asian ones are for personal betterment, like I was talking about with Dharma, for the idea of you're also making society and the world around you also a better place. Certain actions you do have ripple effects that will and consequentially change things down the world and down time. So the better you develop and make yourself a more righteous and upright person, the better in effect some way the world is going to be because of that.
I think it's also interesting. It would like that could be a whole other episode, but about what is perceived as a virtue in
Yes,
the
yeah,
past is not necessarily, like kindness. Like the word kindness means something entirely different now to what it might have meant,
right.
2000 years ago. And especially concepts such as honor, right, are very, very different, and they vary greatly. Um, so like, what is your, like, the two of you, like, what is your approach to in trying to preserve those values in your writing? Do you try to introduce them? Do you just keep on to the sort of more supernatural like elements of the stories, or do you try to bring that flavor of the community's values in your writing?
Do you want to go first or?
I don't mind. I can do. I think I think I've always tried, because I'm writing historical fantasy, so I am writing a story that is in the 10th and 11th century, and so I want the reader to feel that they are there. And so that's why I bring the legal system in. It's why I bring kind of the conflict with the old religion and Christianity. And then, of course, you have the Vikings have settled there. So you have some of the Norse traditions there as well. And so I want people to feel that they understand the culture of the time.
Hmm.
Um, do you bend it so much to make it palatable? I think, is that your question? Like, how far do you go for a modern
Hmm.
audience to understand?
Yeah.
Um, I have tried to be authentic to the time period,
Yeah.
is my answer, because it's not fantasy, it's historical fantasy,
Yeah.
and I wanted to honor the time period. Um, but in saying that, I felt when I researched the laws, as I said, like they actually seemed like fair to me. Like for example, like I've mentioned this uh, example a few times, but in the first book, a girl's hair is cut by someone. Um, and I did that because at the time in the Brehon laws, that was a great crime, like to cut a woman's hair without her permission. It was, you had to pay a big fine for it, because it would have seen that you were diminishing her beauty, perhaps her opportunity to get remarried, social standing, and all of that. And I just find that, God, they thought about everything, like it's in their legal system about, it's, there's violence to women is there too, but actually like cutting her hair. Um,
Hmm.
and I didn't find it then a huge stretch actually to talk about Irish culture and the kind of the pagan system actually at all. I find it kind of, some of that has trickled down and it's still understandable to people today. But maybe if I'd gone further back, it would be more difficult. And actually, my new trilogy, which is set in a different era, we're at this stage where kings are starting to blind princes because they want to be king. And that's a much more like, even though that's closer in time to now, that feels to me much more violent and much more difficult to explain why somebody would do that. If that
It's
does that
fun.
make
It's, yeah,
sense?
absolutely. And I think it's really funny that like the Christian influences can often be really so much more brutal in
Yeah.
the kind of times that are closest to us. Like I was just thinking how a lot of when ancient Slavic sort of lands were Christianized, a lot of what I think are really amazing aspects of ancient Slavic culture. Like, so those concepts of reciprocity, the concepts of respect towards nature, and this sense that we are just a part of a whole. You know, we humans have our sphere, but there's the natural world, and that has its own spirits, you know, to protect it, and respect towards animals and mercy towards animals. Those things were just completely erased. Like there was like, you know, ancient South really valued the concept of empathy, like, you know, literally being able to take on another's pain was like a theme in quite a few stories. Like the thing that breaks the curse is being able to take another's pain onto you. And that was just completely erased because Christian values were more like, well, the earth is for us, so we're the custodians of the earth, so everything is our domain, right? And the animals are beneath us, they have no souls. Whereas like ancient Slavs believed that like horses had dual souls, just like humans, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
all of those nice things are really erased and like lead to more brutal and brutish modes of behavior. What do you think, like, Ronnie, like in terms of like values? Do you like keep it, or is it a distraction, do you think?
I think I keep them, and again, and the lens I'm looking through is mostly through the evolution of Proto-Indo-European, that most of the cultures that evolved through that have similar views, if you go back far enough, again, to pre-Christianization or whatever religions they ended up adopting at a later period, and that they're kind of universal, right? Like some ideas of chivalry or heroism, the idea that every culture had its idea of what was right, but figuring that out is actually kind of hard for youths. And that's actually a theme in some old epics and myths and stories, that if you have a younger character, there's usually some kind of discussion with a parent or heroic or god figure, even a mentor, if I don't know what's right here, I don't know the right choice, and going through maybe war or some kind of trial to figure that out. And I thought that would be a great familiar topic for me to choose and focus on in Tales of Tremaine, because it's told over two timelines. The present day, where my protagonist is a full-grown adult, and his past. And a lot of the struggles are him trying to figure out, how do I fit into the world? What actually is right? I've been told what I thought was right, but he's facing societal hierarchical issues like casteism, which by that name existed in South Asia, but the idea of hierarchical issues were almost universal, built on birth, class, opportunity for work, poverty levels, and he's tackling all of those. So I figured there are ways for me to use the stuff from the cultures and the old epics in terms of values that are universally appealing to everybody. So again, it removes that block of what's foreign. Even if you're experiencing some maybe South Asian things that you're not familiar with, how the character processes them, and maybe what he's going towards, which again is, how do I figure out my place in the world? That's universal enough that it can sort of cut through anything that might be a bit of a road bump or block. And I'm choosing to focus mostly on things like that. And then obviously, because I'm more on the fantasy side than historical, I'm going for sense of wonder. I do get to pick on some of the myths that I think have a reward in just experience a myth. They're very fun, they're evocative, and they appeal to like the fantastical nature people want to see in stories.
Yeah, I mean, I see that, and I think like quite a few Vedas have this sort of journey aspect to them. So it's not about what happens at home necessarily. It's like the hero's journey, isn't it? And like learning what's right in the process of that adventure, and that really lends itself well to the fantasy genre as well, I think, especially epic fantasy genre. On that note, like I feel like there's a lot, like just a glut of retellings coming out right now, and there has been for the last few years. And how do you like navigate? Because, you know, we've been talking about how we kind of keep it close to the original stories, but like how do you navigate using this existing material in your work to not be maybe too literal? And how do you look at the different perspectives available in the existing tales? Like, do you switch things up completely? Maybe let's start with Ronnie this time.
So I definitely actually nod to some in Tales of Tremaine because it's encapsulated with some of the old myths. So I'll try to pick a comparative myth or story that I know maybe exists in other places. I don't want to give away which ones, because part of me has some fun with seeing if readers will figure it out. But in book one, I did a cosmogony myth, which is the idea of how the creation of the universe happened. And there's a lot of similarities between parts of the Greek, the Norse, and the South Asian for how the universe began. There's even some nods to how later on in another story to some Christian stories that are predated by South Asian stories, actually. Similar to the idea of a virginal birth and how it happens, as well as sending a kid downriver. who may or may not be a prince. And I figured if I, again, picked myths that have a universal appeal, or maybe more than one culture appeal, and I retell it, but it's unique to my fantasy world, but the key beats are larger than that. Those are more familiar. That again, it familiarizes the difference on two levels. Both, it might introduce people who aren't familiar with South Asian myths to want to look that up and then find a South Asian myth and go, oh, I didn't realize they had a similar myth. And then also it helps them warm up to the actual differences within my world and how this story might exist in there. So it's serving multiple purposes. That's a personal choice, mostly from craft. I don't know if it's the right way to do it. I just felt that might be a better way, that if every story I'm using or trying to serves multiple purposes, making it do more than one job, because then otherwise, if it's the less work it does, maybe then at that point it doesn't need to be there and it should be cut. But
Well,
it
I
defeats
think
the
you
whole
have a
point of my
couple
story
awards
then.
that say that you're on the right track. So
Thank you.
and like Shauna, like with your historical fantasy, like obviously, you know, you're staying close to the source, but like how do you introduce those sort of mythological aspects in a way that feels fresh to you?
So I have included like the two mythological tribes are just in my story. So it's almost as if they haven't died out, or some of them, well, I suppose the Turidanan have gone underground, but they had children with humans, I guess, and they're still around. So we still have these magical powers. They're enemies of Fomorians, they're still alive. And so there's like a battle between these two tribes as the historical events of 10th century Ireland are unfolding. So that's how I was able to really go back to the source, because it's almost as if it's a continuation rather than a retelling. I'm not retelling the myths that we have. I'm pretending it hasn't ended as such, and perhaps trying to explain then how it did end, because I didn't. Well, again, uh, one of the last stories we have is when a character called Oshin comes back from Tirnanog, and because time is different in Tirnanog than it is in Ireland, he comes back hundreds of years later. And in one of the stories we have, it's as soon as he sets foot in Ireland, he turns to like dust, and you know, because he's dead. But in another version of the story, Saint Patrick talks to him first, and
I
essentially,
memorized that there's like a long poem of that, and like I memorized it in Polish when I was in high
oh
school
right,
for like a poetry competition.
right. Well, there you
I
go.
did
Like,
it, yeah.
yeah, it's like this is the more famous
Yeah, it's
version. Is when
amazing. Yeah.
Saint Patrick appears, but it's basically a conversation between the two of them where it's explaining that, you know, Oshin, you're of the old times, and Saint Patrick is heralding in the new era of the new religion, right? And
Mm.
it's like a conversation, and it's like not bloody. There's no battles. I think it's explaining to people, you know, it's a story to explain. It's okay. You used to believe these things, but as long as now you believe in Christianity, this
Mm.
is like kind of the new thing that's happening. And so I've always found, you know, if you look at mythological tales and then the later folklore tales, I always think it's people trying to explain things to themselves. You know, death, life, birth. Um, and I think in our retellings, because I suppose in the Western world, especially in Ireland, there's been a real collapse of religion. Like in the last 20 years in Ireland, it's been significant, I guess. And I feel probably that's similar to the rest of the Western world.
Well, I don't know. There's like I don't know. It's not the same in Poland. Like there's
No,
the re-emergence of darker aspects of kind of religion, and there's more and more links between kind of Catholicism and Poland. Like it's always been links between nationalism and like patriotism and Catholicism in
yes.
Poland, but now it's like very nationalistic, and it's quite like leaning right wing, and it's kind of scary.
Well, that's funny then, because Ireland went, I think, very left wing actually after the collapse of well, not it hasn't collapsed. Like, I mean, people still go to mass and still people are brought up in the Catholic tradition, but I think the very tight grip that Catholicism had on
Mm.
Ireland has waned.
I think there's disillusionment, I think, with
Yeah, I think it was all the scandals really that came out, you know, like the mother baby homes and the
yeah.
Magdalene laundries and all of that. Like it just, I think people really just came away from it, um, in terms of being super devout. And so people still have their religions, and some people are still very devout, but it's just not culturally embedded in Irish society, shall I say. So I think whenever you have then people going back and looking at these older myths, I think it's perhaps trying to reconnect with like, you know, what alternative ways are there of looking at the world, and what ways did we used to look at the world?
Mm.
And maybe I can explain these things to myself again, like, you know, what do I think about death now? You know, what do I think it is to be a good person? You know, what do I think about life and the world and how we're living in it? And, you know, and I think when you say there's been a huge number of retellings, I really think it is people trying to reteach themselves things and re-explain things and to explore things. And I think huge number of the retellings have been told from a feminine perspective, whereas traditionally they would have come.
So the hidden voices are basically being
hidden
pulled out
voices
and shown you.
Yeah, and so, you know, you used to be, you know, what are these people thinking? Because, and I've said this many times, most people in the world are not the heroes. We're not the kings or the queens or the like champion warriors. We are these normal people that are like are in the background, and the events are unfolding around us that we have no say in, and we're having to cope. And I think that that is a reflection of how a lot of people feel about modern life. You know, we know so much about global politics, and essentially you have very little say in what's happening, you know,
Yeah.
because events that are happening around the world are not really happening in Ireland or being started by anyone in Ireland. So how do I explain my feelings about being alive in a world of chaos and having very little say in what's happening?
Yeah, I
So
think it's interesting
yeah.
about the rules of, like, you know, like folkloric rules, for example, because the people who you know, do have a lot of influence are people who really understand the rules and know exactly how they could break them and know exactly how far they could push on certain elements until the rule either changes or becomes, you know, unenforceable. Like for sure, like, you know, in Slavic mythology, definitely there's a huge emphasis on understanding the rules. Like just because you don't know the rules doesn't mean you're not going to get punished for not following them, right? And especially when it comes to the creatures from the spirit world, like they couldn't care less whether or not you understand that you're supposed to give them like a crust of bread at this particular time, or, you know, put like a pinch of salt here and there. Like they so it's interesting to explore like the people that can use it to their advantage, but they have to have this like knowledge. So, you know, when you say about like people who are kind of powerless, I feel like there's a real power in showing them like the rules so they understand the system, if you see what I mean, like that they are surrounded by.
And do you feel that you see that in the retellings that you're reading? I suppose people trying to, like as you say, like explain the rules of the system that they're in. And is that comforting, I guess?
Yeah.
To explain that?
I think like there's a lot of retellings that I kind of focus on like the trickstery element, you know? That is like, that's what tricksters do. They understand how the system works. They understand how people will react. And then they sort of subvert that to, you know, for good reasons or for bad reasons. Like, you know, we see that in the States. I mean, Ronnie, like right now, your election, I don't want to touch too much on that, but it's all about changing the rules, subverting the rules, and like who can break the
I don't know if
system
there are rules
more.
left in American politics. Yes, that bit's accurate. I don't know what rules are left
or
in our
exposing a lack of rules. That's really interesting in itself. Like when you
yes. No, please go on. Yes, I mean you're
sorry,
right.
we're going to move away
no,
from the depressing subject.
Yeah, politics is very depressing all around everywhere.
I mean, it's exactly.
It always has been, to be honest, though, which is why we
Yeah.
can write about it. Like I go into politics in the first binding and the second book as well. And I'm actually drawing from just how historical courts and certain families have even gained power, maintained it, and lost it. And because it's what Shauna so beautifully touched on. We're all just people. None of us are in political power. We're not leaders, kings, warriors. Historically, artists have always been a commentary on the world around them. Something I heard Jim Butcher once say, which is so beautifully put, is when you write something that's really important to you, you're also writing in another language, a secret language, and other people who've gone through that and resonate it will be the ones who can understand that language. It's why every book has its super fans. And for somebody, your book is the best in the world because whatever unique combination of things you did and commented on through your lens is being understood by that person. And that's really what you're creating, is some kind of response to something around you, something you wish to better understand. Even the old epics were about that. Like Gilgamesh is definitely an idea about death, understanding, because the whole quest is essentially how do you beat death, and then all the fallacies of the character Gilgamesh himself and trying to right all of them, as one of the oldest epics we have. And I don't think that bit has changed. I think humans are always still trying to find our place within the greater things of death, time, age, heroism. And then we have the smaller ones, which is how our stories get a little bit more unique of what time period or issues are we trying to comment on through what lens. Sci-fi will take it to the future, even if it's an old issue redone. Fantasy will go back to the past, and we might take modern things and try to include that discussion there. And then that's just how you end up getting genre at that point.
I don't know if you guys are familiar with one of my favorite comic series, ElfQuest. It's been running since like the 70s. It's like a lot. I grew up reading it. It's like by Wendy Pini and Richard Pini, and there's a phrase in there that I thought was very beautiful about like living the smaller truth inside the larger one. And I thought that was really beautifully done and beautifully thought out, because that you have like Shauna was saying, like, we're not generally heroes, or like we're not the gods, we're not like, so like our power is limited. And so while we have to understand sort of greater context, like the best we can do is live within our small context, isn't it? And I think
that's brilliantly said.
I think the acceptance of that is really difficult. And I think in some ways, like looking at the context of folklore specifically for me, because like for me, the mythology is supposed to be the bigger truth, and the folklore is the smaller truth that is closer to the people and their daily lives. That's the balance, isn't it, between like what Ronnie, what you were saying, between like finding something that is maybe not universal, but like will resonate with people with similar experience, and then including enough sort of universal contexts in your writing as well, like to sort of keep the storytelling like more accessible, maybe, to like and more universal.
It's also a love letter on my part. I want to fully admit, like you both of you also talked about, there's so many divisive things happening in the world, but you opened with how stories connect us. And studying the stuff I genuinely want to focus on something that might be more unity driven, of how many beautiful similarities we have in storytelling, because I think that tells something really important about us. Like, how much do we really love the same kind of ideas and themes and motifs and tales, and that's really a beautiful human thing. That's something we all share. So part of me was also conscientiously picking certain universal themes and stories because I wanted to have readers understand, like, all the familiar things about us as people is a good thing. Like, we have so much in common, and especially in a time where there's a lot of wars going on and people are looking for divisions to capitalize or attack on, that maybe it's better for us to be focusing on the things that make us human. And stories are also connected to other aspects of that, like family gatherings or gathering with friends. Food comes into that, like all the things that break down the barriers hysterically. Like, food has traveled the world and everybody loves eating and everyone loves trying new foods and trying them out. And foods were sort of synonymous with storytelling at one point. People would gather around a fire or a tavern, and I wanted to write towards that vibe if I could.
I think it's a really lovely sentiment, and I think it's like it's very rooted in this kind of traditional storytelling you know, just sort of bringing a community together, and like, or you know, but like now I think there's like a real breakdown of communities in general, and it's people think differently about communities now. They don't, you know, more outside their immediate context. Like, what do you think about it, Shauna? Like in terms of your, like the community that you're writing for as well. Like, what do you sort of try to touch more on those universal things, or do you like to keep things closer to the characters and their own small journey?
Well, I think that depends on the character that you have. So I have some characters who, you know, their objective is maybe just purely the safety of their small family units, and then I'll have other characters that are much more politically motivated, and so they will see things differently. So I feel it's interesting actually to incorporate both, because people are both. You know, I feel as I have gotten older, I'm much more focused on how I can help my family, I guess, purely because I feel I've kind of reached a point where I feel quite helpless in other areas. And so to kind of focus inwards, at least I feel I can be somehow productive. And so one of the characters in my books is like that also, you know, and but then I also find, you know, like if you go out to the bars or the restaurants and you talk to people, you know, people are so varied in what they want to do or how influential they think they could be or can be or are. And yeah, so I think it's interesting to play around with all different types of perspectives that way, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. And on that note, we've kind of run out of time. So thank you guys so much. You have been wonderful. And yeah, I still have some questions I haven't asked, but you know, maybe for next time, yeah.
Yeah, well, anytime. If you ask me
anytime,
to talk about
Yeah.
mythology and folklore, I'm generally there.
So where can people find you? So Shauna, where can people find you?
Well, I have a website which is very easy to remember. It's just www.shaunalawless.com. And I have a newsletter. So if you really want to know what I'm up to, newsletter is best. I do comment occasionally on Twitter and Instagram. And yeah, I suppose my three book, and also I'd say my three books are all out now, so the whole trilogy is complete. And so I feel there's a whole conversation in the trilogy. And so if you want to read them and message me and chat about them, I always love that as well. Lots of my thoughts are in there, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll link to all of that in the description of video. And Ronnie, where can people find you?
My website, but I have to admit I don't use it much. Like I don't know how many authors like get searched by their website anymore in the social media age, but www.rrvirdi.com. I'm definitely more active on Twitter and Instagram, mostly because I just think it's easier for me. You know, you could type a reply really quick, shoot a picture, say what you're up to, and mark it. And the handle there is the same. It's just rrvirdi. And I'm very active there. I do have a newsletter, but it's not very up to date. It's mostly just when I have a new release.
So you don't
I'm always worried
spam
about spamming
people,
people.
which is
Yeah,
very
exactly. I'm
valuable
worried
thing
about
to
that.
mention. Yes.
Yeah, it's like, hey, I've got a new book pre-order or an anthology I'm doing for charity right now to help the survivors and people who suffered the Hurricane Helen. Like that stuff I will talk about, but other than that, it's like I don't want to dump my mythology threads on people every week on a newsletter. Maybe I
Which
should.
is
Maybe I
fair,
should give me more
although
followers.
I feel like people would enjoy a few more, like, you know,
Yeah,
threads on folklore and mythology rather than just the doom scrolling.
Yes, something I'm guilty of. So yeah.
Yeah, I think we all are in this day and age. So thank you guys.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a lovely conversation.
Thank you for watching the video. Click like and subscribe if you would like more. It really helps the channel. Thank you and see you next week.